Not here. Not today. The words cut sharp as the bank teller tore the veteran's check in half, the sound echoing through the silent lobby. People turned, whispering, watching an old man stand frozen in disbelief, clutching his cap against his chest. To the teller, he was just another customer to humiliate. To everyone else, he looked small, powerless, defeated. But in less than 10 minutes, this quiet act of cruelty would unravel the entire bank. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you witnessed this? It was supposed to be a simple day. The veteran, James Carter, woke up early, just as he always did. Decades after leaving the service, discipline was still part of his life. His mornings were calm. Coffee at the same kitchen table, a quiet moment spent looking at the folded flag on his mantle, a reminder of the sacrifices he and so many others had made. James lived modestly. His pension wasn't much, but it was steady, and today he had come to the bank to deposit a government-issued check, one he depended on to cover his bills. To him, it was just another errand. To the people inside that bank, though, it would become a scene they wouldn't forget. He walked slowly into the lobby, his cane tapping against the polished floor. His clothes were neat, pressed with care, though they showed their age just like he did. Customers passed him by, some barely noticing, some glancing at the old military pins on his lapel. Most had no idea who he was, no idea what he had been through, or how much dignity mattered to a man who had already given so much. As James approached the counter, he gave a polite nod to the teller. He wasn't the type to demand attention or make a scene. All he wanted was to hand over his check, watch it stamped, and go home. But sometimes life doesn't unfold so quietly. Because in just a few moments, what should have been routine would turn into humiliation. And not just for James, but for everyone who saw it happen. What would you do if you were in James's place? Standing at that counter, depending on respect, but finding the opposite. Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The line behind James shifted impatiently as he slid the check across the counter. His hands, rough from years of work and service, rested gently on the polished wood. The teller barely glanced at him before rolling her eyes. She was young, sharp in appearance, and her tone carried the arrogance of someone who believed the world revolved around her desk. "Identification," she said flatly, without looking up. James nodded, reaching slowly into his worn wallet. He pulled out his veteran's ID, his driver's license, and even his Medicare card. He laid them neatly in front of her, each one proof of who he was. Proof of a life lived with discipline and sacrifice. But the teller's lip curled in disdain as she picked them up, held them under the light, and sighed as if the process was beneath her. Around them, the bank hummed with low voices, tapping keyboards, and the faint shuffle of paperwork. Yet here, at this counter, the air was thick with tension. James stood still, patience etched into the lines on his face. He had faced far worse in his life: war, loss, long nights spent in silence. But this was different. This was public. This was meant to shame. The teller's voice rose, sharp enough for others to hear. "These don't look valid. This check could be fraudulent." Her words sliced through the room. Heads turned. Customers began to whisper. An elderly man in a veteran's cap accused of fraud in front of strangers. James tried to speak, to explain, but she cut him off with a smirk. She lifted the check high, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. And then, in one deliberate motion, she ripped it in half. The sound was loud, louder than it should have been, like fabric tearing in a quiet room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. James's cane tapped once against the tile as his body stiffened. His check, his lifeline, was gone. Torn apart not because of policy, but because of prejudice. Whispers spread through the lobby. A mother pulled her child closer. A man in a suit muttered, "That's not right." Even the security guard near the door shifted uncomfortably, but did nothing. All eyes were on James, waiting to see how he would react. And yet, James didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand on the counter or demand justice. Instead, he picked up the torn pieces, placed them carefully in his pocket, and straightened his back. The silence that followed was deafening. But what no one realized in that moment was that James was not alone. Behind him, a younger man in line had been watching. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. And he wasn't just any customer. He was someone with enough power to make sure this bank would regret what had just happened. The stage was set. The teller thought she had silenced a veteran. Instead, she had just set fire to the very ground she stood on. The clock was ticking. Within minutes, the entire bank would be in chaos. The younger man stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Excuse me, did I just see you rip up a federal check?" The entire lobby froze. The teller blinked, suddenly less confident, but tried to wave him off. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." But it did, because that man wasn't just any customer. He was a federal inspector, assigned to compliance in financial institutions. And he had just witnessed a bank employee destroy government property, humiliate a veteran, and violate federal law in front of dozens of witnesses. The inspector pulled out his badge and held it high. The color drained from the teller's face. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. Phones were raised, recording every second. James stood in stunned silence, clutching the brim of his cap as the tide of power shifted in an instant. The inspector's voice echoed. "Everyone here is a witness. What just happened is not only unethical, it's criminal." The manager rushed out from his office, sweat breaking across his forehead as he tried to calm the situation. But it was too late. The inspector ordered the security guard to seal the doors until law enforcement arrived. Panic broke out behind the counters. Tellers exchanged nervous glances, and the arrogant woman who had torn the check trembled, her confidence shattered. James, who moments ago stood humiliated, now became the center of attention for a very different reason. People applauded him quietly, some with nods of respect, others with tears in their eyes. For years, his service had been invisible to many, but in this moment, his dignity was restored in the most public way possible. And yet, the tension wasn't over. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The teller's breathing grew shallow as reality sank in. Would she be arrested? Would the bank itself collapse under the weight of this scandal? Viewers, what do you think was about to happen next when those doors opened and the officers walked in? The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed across the glass walls of the bank. Officers stepped inside, greeted not with confusion but with clarity. The inspector wasted no time, detailing exactly what had happened. The torn pieces of the veteran's check were laid out as evidence, along with dozens of witness statements and cell phone recordings already flooding social media. The teller who had mocked James stood frozen, her arrogance stripped away. She was escorted out in handcuffs, her silence a far cry from the sneering voice that had humiliated an old man minutes before. The manager tried to apologize, his words stumbling over themselves, but no one cared. The damage was done, not just to the teller, but to the entire bank's reputation. James, however, wasn't looking for revenge. He simply wanted dignity, respect, and what was rightfully his. The inspector made sure of it. Within hours, the bank's headquarters issued a public apology, vowing to retrain staff and repair the harm done. James's check was not only replaced, it was honored in front of the very people who had once doubted him. But the true impact went far beyond that branch. The story spread online, igniting outrage and sparking conversations about how veterans, particularly veterans of color, are treated in everyday life. Strangers reached out to James, thanking him for his service and apologizing for the disrespect he endured. For once, the weight of his years was lifted by the support of a community that finally saw him. He walked out of the bank that day not as a victim, but as a reminder that dignity should never depend on someone else's bias, that service, sacrifice, and humanity deserve respect, always. And so the question remains, how many more James Carters will it take before society stops allowing prejudice to dictate who is valued and who is dismissed? Tell us in the comments, What would you have done if you stood in that bank and saw it happen?